So, Pete, good to see you.
And you too.
It's good to be in person with someone. So,
I know.
yes, this is my first gathering since March of 2020. So I'm very glad to be here.
Oh, wow. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for coming out of your recluse.
Yes, I'm happy to be here. So, Pete, as one of the co-editors of the book, I also want to just expand the conversation a bit and welcome you to share anything you would want to say about the book project itself before turning to your particular contribution in the book and what is it that you are offering in this volume?
Well, I think, I mean, a lot of the people who have joined this conversation online and some in the room, you'll know that for the last 10, 12 years, I've been involved with Chris Sharon and many others here in a conversation linked to ecclesiology and ethnography and the Ecclesial Practices group at the AAR and the Ecclesial Practices Journal. And so there's been this gathering expertise and awareness, I think, about, so how do we do theology and qualitative research? And in a sense, the book is an attempt to both gather some of those conversations, but also move it forward. And I'm particularly aware that we've got so many people now who are starting doctoral work, PhDs and whatever, around the world, who are wanting to be theologians, but they're wanting to use qualitative research methods. And if I'm honest, and I'll say a little bit more about that when you ask me the next question, it's not straightforward. It's not impossible, but there are things you need to think about and make decisions about. And I hope that this book will give people resources, conversation partners to think about, so what are my choices and what are the implications of the choices that I make as I design my research project? And for those supervising, to begin to open up, you know, for doctoral advisors and supervisors, to begin to open up this field, to say, look, there isn't one way of doing this, there are different ways, each of which might be valid, but there's scholarly precedent for those ways. That's the point.
Thank you. So your chapter is called Theology and Qualitative Research, an Uneasy Relationship.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that and
Yeah.
what you're doing in that?
Yeah, it is. I suppose I wanted to name, and it will come, I think probably the first chapter in the book. I wanted to name the problems and lay it on the table. This is the issue here. And interestingly, I think that that issue is God.
Okay.
That's our big problem. God is our big problem, everyone. And that problem looks different from different directions. People who are my colleagues in the theology department in Durham, we've got some fine anthropologists, had a conversation standing on Palace Green by the cathedral with one of my colleagues. And he said, theology is fine in anthropology, it's just data. And I was like, oh, okay. In other words, for him, theology isn't a theoretical framework or something that intervenes. It's just something that belongs to the field work. It's okay to talk about the theology that the participant group that you're observing might have, but actually to begin to muse theologically.
To do theology yourself.
Yeah. And some sense that as a researcher that you want to do that becomes problematic, you see, from where he's coming from. On the other side, you've got theologians who are sort of saying, well, you can't study God empirically. You can't do empirical work that tells you anything about God, because that's not the way we do it. So theologians will talk about God with sort of abandon. They're very happy to talk about God. However, they're pretty uneasy about the idea that you could do a load of questionnaires and then begin to say something about God. All right. Um, and so it's when you're asking the question, how do we do theology at qualitative research? Getting around the God question and how you're going to play that is a very important one. I don't think there's a right result, a right answer, but you need to know what the issues are and begin to get your head around them.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned when you were setting up the hopes for the project that there are many ways. There isn't just one way, right? There are many ways that we might go about this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there are.
Yes.
There are. And the fact is there are different theologians that have different, they're coming from different traditions with different, approaches.
Mm-hmm.
The point about the book is we're not saying this is the way to do it. We're saying there are these different ways of doing it. I don't want to go through them because I probably wouldn't do a good job of that in the 30 seconds I've got. Read the book, really, I think.
Yes, read the book is what he's just said. So can you talk a little bit more about what you hope, your particular contribution in the book, this chapter about the uneasy relationship? What do you hope it does for the field, the discipline, the church? What are your implications that you're hoping for?
Well, I think one of the issues I think in this whole area is what we mean by academic disciplines. Because part of the issues of what's going on in that, what I've just outlined, the God problem, are actually the conventions of academic disciplines and academic guilds. So there's an epistemological issue that lies at the heart of how we do this. What kinds of knowledge constitute legitimate knowledge, and how do we generate that kind of knowledge? And so what I'm hoping is that we can develop a widening expertise around what that conversation might or might not mean, I think. But I also think I've come at this from mission studies, actually, contextual theology, all of that. And one of the key questions that's been brewing there, both in the mission studies, contextual theology, but also in the gospel and culture movement that was very influential for me, in the UK rather than the US conversation. Part of the issue there was who is a theologian and what constitutes theology. And I think this qualitative research thing is a way of starting to address that directly. It's sort of saying, what are the sources of, I mean, I've done a lot of work now on video, and I'm working on bluegrass music, looking at gospel songs and all of that. Who is a theologian? Is Dolly Parton a theologian? Well, on one level, I think she really is. And what constitutes theology? And I think this conversation is about moving the whole discipline of theology forward in certain ways.
I did not, well, let me ask you this question, then we'll talk about the doctoral research. Thinking about the people who might engage the book, who might, the questions that they might bring, where do you anticipate the tension?
Well, I mean, not everyone will agree with what's in the book, and in a sense, we're there to be bettered, I think. So there may well be people that disagree with what we're saying. I mean, the fact is that there isn't one viewpoint in the book. There are multiple viewpoints. So there'll be people you disagree with, and people you find as friends that you welcome into your life, and there'll be other people that you like. I really can't cope with this. And I'm that way actually about the contributions. I'm like, they're not there because I like them all or agree with them all. They're there because they're an important voice and perspective that should be dealt with, I think.
Thank you. When we first gathered together and thought about having this conversation about the book, sharing information about the book, giving people kind of just some preliminary information about what was coming, we entered into a conversation about doctoral studies and what it was like to do this work as doctoral students, but also what it's like to advise this sort of work as an advisor. And so what are your hopes for doctoral studies, advising the future of doctoral work, that you hope that this book might encourage?
Well, Easton said something in that conversation to me that I thought was brilliant, which was, oh, do we have to just go round the methodological issues here? I just want to make a difference. You know, do you remember saying something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah. And I thought, oh, okay. And I thought, well, that's the heart of it, isn't it? We're doing this for a real purpose, a transformative purpose. It's not an end in itself, that conversation. So one of my hopes is that it will enable people to do the kind of theology that will make a difference into the future. And I think that's why so many doctoral students want to do this, because whether it's somebody like yourself working on education in the penal system, or whether it's somebody like Glenn, who's going to speak later in this conference, working on mega churches and charismatic, you know, diametrically opposed. But in each of these places, people are doing research because they want to make a difference. And the feeling is that qualitative research gets you to this grounded place, to the granular. And actually, those are the places where you want to make the difference. And so that would be my first thing. The second thing is, hidden throughout all of this is a sort of turning away from established methods in practical theology that emphasize correlation. To sort of say, the idea that you do your sociology bit and then your theology bit, you know, and then you link them together. Now, it's not, the case is, academic voices from different disciplines have got to be there speaking to each other. But the idea that you silo the one thing from the other thing, and then you say, if you're doing interviews or participant observation or content analysis or whatever it is, you are a social scientist at that moment rather than a theologian. And I think the challenge to the academy is to say, no, you can be a theologian and do those things. But then what does that mean? And that takes you to all those epistemological issues.
Absolutely. What have been some of the challenges or difficulties you think in trying to advise people who want to do this sort of work?
Well, one of the things I really love about the Ecclesiology and Ethnography conference that we hold in Durham, do come everyone, in September every year, we do this thing, are the helpful conversations that people share with one another. And it's moved doing theology from a kind of combative thing about ideas, you know, is my idea sound, do I disagree with your idea? And it's moved it to the idea of a collaborative craft.
Exactly.
And people are just rooting for each other. How do you go about doing this? What's the best way of being in interviews with people? I just love that about it. I really, really love it about it. And so, the challenges for most students are getting your head around the intricacies of that thing. I mean, I've got that now. I've just done 35 interviews with bluegrass fans about what they think the gospel, you know, the gospel music means to them. And they're all from all sorts of different religious traditions and none. And now I've got this massive data that I'm thinking, oh, how do I make sense of this, you know? I'm in the middle of it like my students are. And I like that.
That's wonderful. Good. Is there anything else you would like to tell us about your particular chapter?
No.
Okay, good.
A great bluegrass book coming up, though.
Go ahead and, yes. Feel free to also plug your other books in the midst of our conversation today. That is also totally fine. Thank you, Pete.